taking extensive close looks. Initially, I also thought I would make it easy for myself today and tell you the basics about the 18th dynasty glass inlays, show you a few examples from Tutanchamun's tomb and elsewhere that provide interesting information about their making and use, and finally discuss what this means for the manufacture of the object as a whole. But alas, how wrong can one be? As it happens, when I went into medias res again in preparation for this lecture, I had to realize that, and I really hate to say that, I don't know everything and that there's still quite a bit to discover that first needs a closer consideration from my side. That's why for today's talk I will have to slightly shift the main focus of the talk from the opaque colored inlays onto the reverse painted glass inlays, which are partly published already, but I can present a few unknown examples that still show why it's even the more important to take a really close look on things, as I slightly pretentiously admonished in my title. So, where are we regarding the use of glass during Tutanchamun's time? As most of you know, the glazing of small beads and objects made of steatite, quartz, or the so-called Egyptian faience already existed in the Near East and Egypt at the end of the 5th millennium BC. And after a long period of experimentation, glass could be produced as an independent material from the middle of the 16th century BC onwards. Tutanchamun's tomb furnishings were probably mostly made at some time in the 14th century BC and therefore still in a rather early stage of this new technology. His tomb contained thousands and thousands of colored inlays on jewelry or weapons, chariots and furniture, countless I wanted to present this. Countless beads and some amulets made of glass, as well as an admittedly small number of furniture, utensils, and vessels made of this exceptional man-made material. But even this modest quantity of objects suggests a particularly high level of glass art. In the picture, you see the two outstanding headrests weighing almost 2 kilos, the 42 centimeter long writing palette, the vessels, and some of the smaller items from the tomb. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once wrote, and please excuse my ignoble translation, if you want to enjoy the entirety, you have to see the entirety in the smallest things. And no phrase is more appropriate when we turn our gaze now at the smallest pieces of glass from the tomb, the beads, and most of all the inlays. Let's take a quick look at the beads first. Here, for example, the very prominent beadwork, the elaborated skull cap depicting winding a rail snake made from red and blue glass beads and gold beads, sewn to a delicate fabric that once covered the neatly shaved head of the king and is unfortunately lost today. On the contrary, this little necklace that was placed directly on the neck of the deceased. And therefore, despite its seemingly unimposing appearance, it must have been anything but insignificant. Many of the beadworks did survive only in bits and pieces, and without Howard Carter's documentation and Harry Burton's in situ photographs, we would have no idea how they once might have looked. Like for the inlays from the tomb, we notice also for the manufacture of the beads a wild mix of materials like the so-called Egyptian faience, glassy faience, glass, precious stones, and even artificial pigments like Egyptian blue. Meanwhile, I believe there are also some unknown in-between materials, but it's currently impossible to exactly identify them and give them a proper name. Examples of fully sculptured small glassworks cannot be described precisely as inlays and are only found on a few artifacts from the tomb. A particularly graceful and elegant work is a pair of small duck or goose earrings, heads on a pair of Tutanchamun's earrings, which were fixed to a pack by means of an adhesive. Betwixt and in between are also the glass pieces on a ceremonial sickle of Tutanchamun. The red, orange, turquoise, and medium blue serrated inlays are actually inserted in a greenish, resin-like material and imitate the cutting edge of the sickle. In fact, they are very sharp. But they differ from most other inlays in that they protrude out of the object three-dimensionally, and the same counts, for example, for the beaker of a vulture on the burial mask, its original color being dark blue. Sometimes the true inlays are flat slices of differently profiled glass rods, whereby it can be assumed that some of the semi-finished products were already specifically prepared with regard to the shape of the respective inlays. In other cases, however, the contour of the inlays was rather roughly grown from such slices in order to adapt them more or less successfully to a specific cell or pit shape. In addition, smaller sections of filigree glass rods, partly bent into shape, were used as inlays. By stretching a heated glass rod, its cross-section could be reduced even further in order to bring some color into the finest pits or cells. In case of the scarab amulet that was placed on the mummy's chest, the extraordinarily thin, some are only 1/3 of a millimeter, fine red glass rods for the legs of a Benu bird are particularly remarkable, or likewise the tiny segments that adorn alternately the seams of the costumes of the captives on the handrail of one of the state chariots. Furthermore, there are inlays made in half relief. For their specific shaping, hot glass was pressed into prefabricated molds, or crushed glass was melted directly in a mold. Fine details of their decoration were subsequently worked out by carving if necessary. Please imagine the raw glass after reheating for further processing as a very viscous material that can be modeled freehand maybe, or like I said, being pressed into molds, but definitely not poured into a mold, as the firing temperatures required for this could not be achieved at the time. A large inlay that was obviously made by pressing the hot glass into a mold is an almost 30 centimeter long inlay in the shape of a cartouche from the British Museum collection. Its backside demonstrates par excellence how the viscous batch was pressed and squeezed into a mold, creating even some folds before its surface was then flattened. The mold in this case was an open mold, probably made in one piece. Magnificent inlays can also be found on the Golden Throne, for example, a small hieroglyph in the shape of a chick from its armrest, or the incredibly gorgeous red body and face inlays of the king and the queen from the scene on the backrest. The glass from the tomb was colored in some of the common shades of the ancient Egyptian color repertoire, lots of dark and light blues, and more rarely red, yellow, green, and violet, as well as the achromatic colors white and black. The inlays were usually placed in small cells or pits, and both can take a single or multiple inlays assembled in a mosaic-like manner. An inadequate fit was in any case concealed by fixing materials, often called cement for whatever reason, pigmented in the individual corresponding color, as we can see on the beard of the burial mask. Even though these particular inlays fit much better than almost any other inlay I have seen from the tomb anyway. Please note the Egyptian blue pigments. I hope you can see it in this light. Crystals in the detail below. We also noticed the use of transparent, colorless glass inlays, and in view of the fact that only rare examples of this glass from the time were known to us, the number of examples from the tomb, so far more than 350, was somewhat surprising. Unexpected in its extent is also the fact that these inlays are mostly painted on the reverse side, making them very early examples of reverse painting on glass. The identification of this technique was complicated by this small medallion from Dashur that already had been found in 1895 and was usually described as colored painting on plaster or a mosaic that was covered with a transparent rock crystal inlay. In this assessment, a transparent inlay covering a painting seems to have been applied automatically to most similar finds thereafter. Let's look back to the development of the transparent eye inlays first. The reverse painting of eye inlays made of glass continues the long tradition of painting or somehow coloring rock crystal inlays on their back. An impressive example you all know comes from the statue of Rahotep dating to the 4th dynasty, and only the iris of the eye is made of rock crystal. I believe that the gray-blue color we see today is false and that the colored material has shrunk due to age. As a consequence, air had intruded between the inlay and the color layer, making the color appear much lighter than it actually is. A rock crystal inlay for a complete eye, said to come from the 4th dynasty too, is this little piece from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, with remnants of much more elaborate painting on its backside. The shape of the inlay and the still visible horizontally contradicted oval pupil, or rather a ghost of it, you can see it here, suggested to be the eye inlay of a ram or an ibex. A unique variation occurs on the famous bust of Nefertiti, merely a few years older than most finds from Tutanchamun's tomb. The preserved eye inlay made of rock crystal was made with a lenticular cavity in the size of the iris on its back, which was filled with a black wax that also served to fix the inlay on the limestone. This in turn represents the white of the eyeball. Among the tomb furnishings, however, with few exceptions only, the eye inlays, if not made from rather opaque materials like stone or obsidian, are made of glass instead. They can roughly be divided into two groups. A somewhat simpler variant shows either a black dot painted on the reverse of the inlay to represent a pupil, here on the Uraeus snake on Tutanchamun's mummy mask top left, or below on an eye inlay of the Uraeus snake from the king's magnificent diadem. This has a small cavity on its backside that is filled with color pigments and thereby reinforces the three-dimensional depth of the eye. In either case, the eyeball is colored in a reddish-yellowish tone, and both versions are found exclusively on the cobras. A third subtype can be identified on this little snake amulet of carniole. The pupil is again painted at the back of the glass eye, which is not an inlay but simply glued onto the surface of the amulet. And thus the color for the eyeball is the carniole itself. The second group shows a more detailed version of eyes, like the rock crystal inlay from the 4th dynasty we have just seen. These appear as eyes of gods and animals like ibexes, leopards, cheetahs, and lions, as you can see here, or on an example, as you can see here on an example from the ritual lion couch to your left, or on the lion head protomes on the golden throne to your right. The technical term reverse painting not only describes the placement of the painting on the back of the glass, but also the reverse order of different layers of painting. In this case, first the details, the red in the corners of the eyes, the pupil and the contour of the iris, followed by the yellowish iris, and finally the white eyeball. These eyes show actually stereotypically painted details, the exact same decoration of eye inlays made of quartz and glass over more than 1200 years. A rare exception of a human eye can be found on this statue of the king as a young Horus, on which also the complete inlay has been painted on its back. The painting, in this case, a very dark shade paired with pristine white, is reminiscent of the head and body inlays of a Bennu bird on a golden heart vessel amulet. Once again, they show impressively what a thin layer of air that has penetrated between the inlay and the layer of paint can do. At the crack that runs through the inlay of the body, the paint has partially detached from the glass inlay, and here too we see how, as a result, a color that is actually dark, in this case blue, can only be perceived as a milky light gray shade. The head was also originally blue. Other age-related color phenomena not only make it difficult to identify the original color, but even make it almost impossible to recognize any painting at all, as in this example from Tutanchamun's golden dagger. Note the little dark inlay for the bird's body that we suspected to be painted on its back, but at the time we could not document it. Only recently we were able to take infrared pictures, and now look. Out of the nothing appears a tiny feather pattern, a contour for the head and the eye of the bird. A large number of reverse painted inlays decorate the inscriptions on objects that were made exclusively for the burial, so the other side in the title of the slides gets an additional connotation here. For example, on the small canopic coffins, altogether more than 35 of their inlays show reddish monochrome paint, and only a single example, I owe this to Tom Hardwick, where is he? In the shape of a little fish, shows details elaborated in bichrome painting, and the small inlay is hardly 7.5 millimeter wide. On the mummy bands, we find a similarly large number of transparent glass inlays. Unfortunately, these could not be examined on the object, but only on the basis of this fantastic photography by Sandro Vanini, whom I would like to thank for his generosity in providing me with some of his captivating pictures at this point. So far, only 2 hieroglyphs inlays carrying a polychrome painting could be identified. Here you see the better preserved example of the sign sail. The mast and the ridging were painted with a red colorant first, and the sail in a dark blue color in a second step. The mast is extended downwards here, beyond the transparent inlay by means of a red glass rod. This extension of a painted detail by an opaque inlay, or vice versa, is a stylistic and creative finesse we are going to find on the next object too. The young king, as most of you know, was laid to rest in 3 nested coffins. The middle coffin bears an inscription running around the upper edge of the trough that includes 4 hieroglyphs in the shape of ducks or goose. The head and the wing inlays are painted on their backs again and combined with opaque glass inlays of dark and light blue with red for the legs and feet. The material they are inserted to is again neatly differing in matching colors. We see here, I hope it's noticeable for you, there's a reddish tone around the feet. Here we have a greenish tone for the turquoise inlays, very, very dark, almost black for the blue inlays, and around here a beige tone. And in this detail, you can see how this dark blue inlay, it goes up to here. Here's nothing, but the fixing material is painted. And here you see it's not connected, the reverse painting on the head inlay continuing again the blue glass inlay. Comparative pieces can be found on coffins from Tutanchamun's forebears, the coffin of Huia, even though this inlay is made of a transparent stone. Due to horror vacui and for illustration, I added a lovely watercolor painted by Howard Carter himself, illustrating the natural appearance of the bird. Other examples come from the coffin from the tomb of KV55 in the Valley of the Kings. They might have been made for... It is a little difficult to distinguish in the pictures, but the blue color of the wing and the red color between the tips of the feathers partially overlay the black contour lines, indicating that they are painted in a later step, which is again the reversed order. But as we have noticed already, objects that were in use during the king's lifetime, like the dagger or some of the jewelry, were also decorated in this technique. Very prominent is the golden throne we have glimpsed at already, an armchair that was evidently not made of solid gold, but gilded with gold foils. No need to explain the scene on the backrest to this audience, but maybe to point out that it includes overall 46 polychrome painted glass inlays in its incredibly elaborate decoration. Again, I'm only to highlight a few. To begin with, I would like to draw your attention to the seat cushion, which at first glance looks rather like an inconspicuous reddish pad. What can be seen on closer look becomes more obviously by color manipulation that enhances a neatly painted Amarna textile pattern, also known as the Amarna Royal Red Fabric. An identical design is shown in this wall painting from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where all matting and the cushions show this characteristic pattern. Sophisticated inlays painted with great attention to detail also decorate in large numbers the columns in shape of a flower bouquet. Oops. At their top is a complex arrangement of mature and close papyrus umbels. Other examples are arranged further down. 2 striking details can be noticed here. The papyrus umbels are not only painted in different colors again, a darker green and a light beige color, but show signs of a delicate decoration technique that is in a way technically the same like an iglomise or similar, which is basically known to us from the late antique periods onward. In our examples, it seems that the thin lines of the flower stalks were scratched or incised into a layer of paint that was applied as a first step, with a second layer of darker paint being added subsequently. This picture is under UV light only. A different botanical motif shows lotus buds and blossoms. The individual petals are still quite recognizable, but here too the colors have changed to a critical degree due to age. A very likely color reconstruction would look like this. A prime example of another clandestine, hitherto overlooked detail is the little seemingly unimposing footstool. It's made from a single inlay that depicts the stool itself as well as the cushion on top of it. Superficially, we see on the footstool a series of red and dark dots and lines on a dark background with a whitish something in the middle, again for the moment not very meaningful details. On closer inspection, we can see some darker, cloudy structures here, but since we all cannot stare at this until Christmas, and this would be as long as it took me to understand what's depicted here, let me again add a little alchemy, first a color manipulation, and most helpful in this particular case, an infrared photography. Two captives are lying face down with their hands bound behind their backs, and the red and dark dots embellish the seams of their costumes. To the left, a captive from the Near East, vis-à-vis to its right, its counterpart of Nubian origin with a feather in his hair. The width of the inlay in this area measures 5 centimeters only, attesting the depiction to be a veritable miniature painting. Since it's a standard motif of the Royal Iconographical Repertoire, it's hardly surprising that it is, for the sake of reassuring probably, painted on the cushion too. Less clearly visible, hiding in the pattern of the Amana royal red fabric, are again a Near Eastern captive on the left, the Nubian eye-to-eye on the right. Possibly the bending, that's wild speculation, of the bodies here intends to emphasize a dynamic deformation or movement of the cushion through its use. Other miniature paintings can be found on the pair of iconographically most complex earrings with the ducks or goose heads we have already seen. These are actually the best known reverse painted motifs from the tomb, since they were shown early on in this beautifully, almost photorealistic drawing by Winifred Mabel Brunton, probably made in the 1920s. But being placed in the showcase, like in the picture to your right, they were hardly visible and merely noticed. Also, it was, with few exceptions only, commonly assumed that, here we go again, the motif was painted on the background and was only covered up by the inlay. Attached to the front of the tubes that fix the earrings to the earlobes are the small circular glass inlays showing a miniature painting of a portrait of the king. At the back are even slightly smaller inlays with a concentric decoration. In this case, the use of UV light is again the means of choice to emphasize the colors, showing in detail the king with the blue crown, the ureus snake at his forehead, that fluttering streamers in his neck, and with 2 folds beneath his chin. The depiction on the earrings as well as on the footstool are not only truly outstanding because they were brilliantly made and depict people en miniature, but also differ from the others in that the shape of the inlay is not related with what is painted on them. Bust portraits like the one of the king are rare in ancient Egypt and usually only come as trial pieces of craftsmen. Above all, this is unique in that it's the only painted portrait of an Egyptian king decorating a piece of jewelry. Coming to an end, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities in Egypt, our dear colleagues from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, who permitted and helpfully supported this research. I'm also very grateful to the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo, which has been an excellent partner in our work for so many years now. And of course to the Griffith Institute of the University of Oxford for taking care so well for the excavation documentation, a truly essential source for our studies. However, that archive material is why we know even charming little details. For example, that Howard Carter found a wooden box with 8 compartments, carefully stuffed with papyrus, but unfortunately it was already emptied. He expected it to have contained objects of delicate nature, probably glass vessels, that were possibly stolen for their contents in antiquity. On the object card, he solely remarked, "Damn, triple exclamation mark." I have said this elsewhere before, but given the fact that he found all we have seen today, unparalleled glassworks from the late Bronze Age in Egypt, notably thousands of the most elaborate and artful glass inlays on the jewelry, the coffins, the burial mask, the weapons, the furniture, and even the state chariots, a scribbled damned appears a bit ungrateful to me. Thank you.
We have 2 minutes for questions. Anyone have any questions? There's one here? Okay. Can we get the mic, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much for such an interesting talk. And excuse my ignorance.
Sometimes it doesn't. What you cannot always do with the naked eye is distinguish between several different precious stone inlays. Sometimes some look very similar, and as you know, some of the precious stones they have, or semi-precious stones, it's not a correct term. They have certain areas in the stone. So if you make an inlay from this area, it looks a little bit different than this. So in detail, if you want to distinguish between the stones, you need a little more effort. But the difference between glass and stone inlay is easy.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We don't have any more time for questions. Okay. We'll have to start our next session.